Okay, so when looking at the short-handled crystal brushes, for me personally, when I'm talking about them, I usually try to consider my audience and what they're looking for. Um, it is rated as a high rating watercolor brush as well as an acrylic brush. I tend to suggest the Silver Whites as my watercolor brush, but these are equally good. I keep them in this little short handle Monaco case here. And for me, with watercolor, the brushes or the filaments are not as dense as the silver white, but they're really good for me for glazing. And what I mean by glazing is anybody that's going to be using multiple translucent or transparent layers, and that could be build up on acrylic, etc. So that's primarily what I'm going to show you today is how I talk to the students about using them as a foundation brush for acrylic. Now, there's several different viscosities of acrylic, and I don't think that heavy body is a good one for the crystal. It certainly could be, but it's obviously a thicker consistency, and the crystal brushes are listed as a soft filament. So what tends to happen when you have a soft filament is that it basically collapses. And so the heavier the viscosity of the paint, the harder it has a time of dispersing and spreading. So I've got an angle brush here. I'll also take this little filbert here, wet both of them. And you can just kind of see when I pull the heavy body, you know, it still gets a nice good fluid movement, mostly because I'm working on the glass here too, but also because I don't have really heavy distribution. The more paint that I tend to put down, the soft filaments don't navigate through it quite as easily as it would if it were a thinner viscosity. So this is the fluid, which I really like, using with fluid and high flow. Fluid just kind of glazes it on there. You see it's smoother, it's more see-through. Again, working on a glass surface definitely helps. But the smoother the surface or substrate, the better it works. And then high flow, which is my favorite, just puts a fine gloss on there, and that's all done with the angle brush. And you can see the transparency between the different viscosities really helps. It's not that the paint's more transparent, it's the disbursement of the brush. So there are some thicker mops that specifically I think would be great for watercolor. They do have a harder time going through the thicker paints, especially when you're working on a tacky or heavy surface. So I can just kind of run the mop through those, and you see you get more of a buildup of color when working with those. But I found for me that the higher the viscosity with the crystal brushes, the better. So high flow is my ultimate favorite, and I'll show you why. And I'm comparing it to something else short handle, kind of like the Mansa. The Mansa to me has a more dense filament, and it's great with oils, fluids. I really use them a good bit. These crystals I more call as my finishing brush, meaning that when I'm really usually wrapping up a work is when I turn to those. So if I were glazing, for example, on a smaller work, something like this, then I could just take a flatter crystal brush and just take a color. Maybe we'll use a little bit of anthraquinone, which is a indigo basically, and just take a little bit of that. This is just a heavy woven textured canvas, and I can just glaze right on top of that. And the filament is really soft. It gets into the grooves, but it just disperses those thin layers of paint. So I could build my way up. You know, whenever I'm painting something white, I like to do layers of dirty white, is what I call it, meaning that I build up to my brighter whites. And the crystal's really good for that because you can work a lot of translucent colors on there and keep it nice and soft. So I could continue to put color on there, and I'd get something opposing so that we have a little contrast, right? Okay, it really gets in the grooves of the canvas, so that works out well, being able to glaze and go over the material. So another thing that I might like to use them on is a finer, smoother surface. For example, this is a painting on a smooth prime ampersand board, And maybe I just want to glaze a little bit of highlights in there, so I could use something like a high flow yellow and maybe take one of my larger crystal brushes here, whether it be an angle or a flat, and I can just take my yellow and glaze some of the yellow on top so that I can really bring out the color. And again, I wouldn't even introduce the crystals until I'm toward the finished ending of the painting. So a lot of times when the brush bristles are soft and supple, they tend to not be great for heavy application, including block end or scumbling, because they'll really tear up the edge of the bristles. So these bristles are listed as a little bit more soft and supple, so obviously when I'm pressing down they get a really high flex, and I don't usually recommend that students block in with those types of brushes just because they're so collapsible. Usually something more firm will distribute and get the ground coats of paint down, and when you're doing these soft finishing layers you can just kind of glaze across, and the brushes give to the pressure so that it makes for easier, more continuous strokes, and then you can really bring in, you know, that color. And if I wanted to pale out some of this white and just put some little highlights in there, I can just offset that using the angle, pull it in different directions, and just get my cast lighting in there. Okay, and this would be something more polished. The crystals are really good for your toll painters, your decorative painters, finishing touches, a lot of script work in watercolor, things that are very definite, meaning that you put down, you know, your top layer and you're kind of done. Or it could be more towards working on layers and translucent layers. I have this painting that is a little bit of different textures and media, and still using the same principle. I may choose to use a darker color in the crystal brush to kind of anchor or unify some of the perseverated strokes. So I can go in with a glaze and just kind of put down, you know, a soft anchoring dark wash. And I'm just using some of this anthraquinone or indigo. And I can just glaze, and it helps, you know, give me that see-through so that I can still see the texture and the strokes that were beneath it. I think a lot of times what I watch students do is they try and use one viscosity of paint to do their entire painting, and when they try to blend and glaze with the heavy body or the traditional acrylic, they end up covering up tons of their previous layers. And so I like the higher viscosities and the softer brushes like crystal, because you can really add some application on top of your work without really concealing a lot of the mark making and layers beneath, because you have a nice fluid glaze, you've got a nice transition, you can see the things that are beneath. It's just really really a lot more helpful. And I think a lot of people don't know that they can switch gears like that. They have a lot of brushes, or they don't really understand the viscosities of the paint. They think that if it's a high flow, it's going to be used as a watercolor, etc. So again, it just comes to knowing the audience. They certainly can be used with watercolor and as watercolors, but I think also they'd be great for just building those translucent layers. So you could see how you can continue to build, but really seeing the mark making and the items that are underneath. I can see all the colors and just get these nice smooth fluid movements. That's why it'd be good for toll or decorative painting, because they have a lot of smooth fluid movements as well. Now with something more textural, with a base coat down like this, it's got, you know, some items, and maybe I want to create more depth or more energy into the painting. So I can use a brush like crystal, and whether it be a combination of fluid or whether it be the high flows, I can add some more translucent layers. I'm going to try and darken my darks, and I'm going to do that with a mixture of high flow indigo and a little bit of fluid magenta, and put just a dash of oxide in there to neutralize it. And I just want to push this a little bit deeper in some areas, and because of the supple nature of the brushes, they can really get in those grooves and cracks. And again, you can still see a lot of what was down before, but it gives it a lot of rich depth because I'm just putting a glaze layer on top. right? So for a lot of mixed media artists, as long as the surface wasn't highly textured, you know, where it's abrasive, where it's going to tear up the brushes, the crystals are a little bit more delicate. There are delicate little flower. So really it's just going to be soft progressions that really work best with it. And I can just do some of the deep mark making there just to kind of darken my darks and pull some things in. I might want to create some off tones here since this is looking a little too green, and just bring some other colors into the party just to break it up a little bit. But anyway, it goes over that texture and has a really absorbent tendency. Okay. Now, as far as a traditional block-in, I could use something like acrylic paper here to give myself. Now, as far as a traditional block-in, I could give myself like an acrylic paper where I have a little bit more movement and texture. So as far as a traditional block-in, I can use something like an acrylic paper here and just go back into my series of high flow. And again, I'm just going to use the filbert here just to lay down some translucent layers and just do some mark making so you can see how they flow through. If you were using them in a higher viscosity like watercolor, then you could certainly put down multiple layers and have a little bit more of a delicate feeling. Now with this, I like working in the translucent layers because you could do some kind of block in, but you see it's kind of got a little bit more of an abrasiveness on the brush. Not that it couldn't be, you know, reconstituted and fluffed out, but with my application I like using a little bit more of a stiff brush, and I'll switch over to the Monza short handle to do the same thing. You see, because the filament seems to be a little bit more dense with these, they get a really good block in going. And I'm using all high flow, so you know, the same kind, but because the filaments are more dense and it's a little bit more fluffy, it gets a great base coverage. Then I'd be switching over to my crystal so that I could put some kind of glaze properties on top and just kind of accentuate with what's already being worked with. See, just adds a smoother mix. Okay, and then you can also use the crystal for working over texture. So we have some textured pieces here to the side, and if I were going to glaze some color on top of that, I could use, you know, the soft bristles to just kind of work over the surface, or if I wanted to wet a little bit more, I could work in between. But again, the more textured the surface is, if it's gritty or sanded, you know, you run the risk of tearing up your filaments, but that's kind of the case with any brush. But again, these are our delicate little flowers, so they're good for final mark making and just being really light over texture and other applications. So hopefully that helps to answer a few. There's a lot of different availabilities, like the liner, which could be used for fluid drag marks, and you know, you have a lot of the students that want to put some of those final strokes in, and eyelashes and tree branches and etc. So the liner is really great for that. And there's a couple of round brushes where you can do some one-touch applications, but the longer rigger brushes or liners are typically good for your drag marks. So you have a variety that you can use. These are all high flows, similar to the viscosity of watercolor that I'm using. So you can create a lot of different mark making with that. And then a lot of these rounded filaments I tend to use as more of my glaze style brushes. So I'll use a little bit of blue here and just kind of come down. See the mop type tendency, it doesn't have as much control because it's going to kind of flag with the viscosity of the paint. So you can get kind of a bushy type mark, but it's very uncontrolled. I can't really navigate it as much as I could if it were a total fluid watercolor, something a little bit more. You see, when there's more water and viscosity added, then I can do a little bit more control with it. The mops, they don't work well with dry paint unless you want the uncontrolled look. So hopefully this helps out. There is a wide wash brush, which I forgot to bring with me, but I really love that for laying some big, thick, translucent layers in my watercolor work. But hopefully this gives you an idea of glazing with the crystal. The price point's reasonable, so any student looking to expand their finishing brushes to glaze pieces, it's a real easy sell. They're short-handled, so typically you're going to be close to the work, so it's going to be a lot of tabletop or maybe some hand finishing in some refined areas. So those are some things to consider when you're looking at silver crystal.